They told you the Donnellys were nothing more than a rowdy, violent clan, murderers, thieves, an embarrassment to Canada's history books. But history, as you've been taught, is never the truth. It's the cleaned-up story handed down by the victors, carefully bleached of the bloodstains they don't want you to see. What if I told you the real Donnelly story is not about petty crime, but about a generational curse of blood purity, inbreeding so deep it warped minds, bodies, and destinies? And what if I told you the people who condemned them, the churchmen, the lawmen, the self-proclaimed good citizens, were just as rotten, only better at hiding it? You're about to hear a truth that was never meant to leave the grave. In 1876, the Donnelly name was feared in Biddulph Township, Ontario, but their origins didn't start there. They began in a backwater of County Tipperary, Ireland, where cousins married cousins, where bloodlines were bound not out of love, but out of control, a family locked in on itself. No outsiders, no dilution, just the same blood over and over, until it became something else. Inbreeding changes more than the jawline, more than the skin. It changes how the mind processes morality. And when that bloodline crossed the ocean to North America, it carried more than bad genetics. It carried an old code. A code that said the Donnelly name must survive at any cost, through violence, manipulation, and the silent elimination of threats. The township feared them not because they were criminals, but because they could not be broken. Land disputes, barn burnings, beatings, every attempt to destroy them was met with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. And maybe it was. Old Irish whispers tell of tainted lines that carry an ancestral rage, a hunger for dominance so deep it outlives the flesh. But here's the part the history books never print. The Donnellys had dirt on everyone. Priests caught in scandal, sheriffs taking bribes, farmers running illegal trade. In a town where everyone sinned but only some were punished, the Donnellys became the convenient villains, the scapegoats to cleanse the reputations of the truly powerful. The night they were wiped out wasn't justice. It was a purge, a ritual cleansing of inconvenient blood, and what followed was darker than anything the coroner dared write down. The purge didn't happen in daylight. No, men like that don't spill blood when the sun can bear witness. It happened in the cold, suffocating blackness before dawn, the hour when God seems to turn his face away and the devil walks without a shadow. They came as a mob, not soldiers, not officers, farmers, shopkeepers, church elders, faces you'd nod to in the street, men who'd tip their hats to your mother on a Sunday morning. But that night, they hid under sacks and scarves, their eyes cold, their hands gripping clubs, pitchforks, and guns wrapped in burlap to muffle the sound. They called it justice. But in truth, it was an execution, planned with the precision of a military strike and the cruelty of a vendetta older than memory. The Donnelly homestead wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of survival, every board in the walls soaked with generations of defiance. But when the mob reached it, they didn't knock. They broke in like a flood. James Donnelly, the patriarch, woke first. He must have known in that instant that the end had come. Not the kind of end where you can talk your way out, not the kind where you can bribe or fight. This was the end written in the family's blood the moment they stepped off the ship in Canada. His wife Bridget barely had time to rise from the bed before the blows began. No trial, no accusations, just impact, wood on bone, steel and flesh. The youngest boy, Johnny, still a child, tried to run. They caught him before he reached the door. Some say his cries could be heard a quarter-mile away. Others say the night was so still it swallowed the sound entirely. By the time the mob left, the Donnellys were no longer human shapes, just broken forms in the dim light of an oil lamp. The floorboards drank their blood. And then came the final insult, the torch. Flames devoured the house, erasing the crime under the guise of destroying the nest of vipers. But here's what most people don't understand. This wasn't a random eruption of hate. This was a ritual. The timing, the secrecy, the unanimous silence afterward, it all points to something older, something imported from the old world. This wasn't just murder, it was a blood offering. And once you see it that way, you start to wonder who the offering was for. You have to understand, rural Ontario in the 1800s wasn't just farmland and church bells. Beneath the veneer of piety, the settlers carried with them the oldest parts of the Old World, and the Old World never traveled light. It carried famine scars, clan rivalries, whispered curses, and rites that were already ancient before Christianity touched Ireland. The Donnellys were born into that soil, not just physically but spiritually. Their bloodline wasn't random, it was engineered. In Ireland, cousin marriage wasn't just about keeping land. It was about keeping power in the family. Not wealth in coins, But the kind of influence that's woven into superstition and fear. There are legends, almost forgotten now, about bloodlines that could call the storm, that could not be poisoned, that could curse the milk of an enemy's cows for a generation. Most people today laugh at such things. But the settlers of Biddulph Township, they didn't laugh. They believed it, feared it, and acted on that fear. And that's where the ritual comes in. Look closely at what happened that night. The mob didn't just kill, they killed everyone. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't leave one to bury the dead. That's a purge pattern, the deliberate removal of an entire branch of a lineage. In Gaelic folklore, that's called Cath Ganile, a war on the blood. It's not about justice. It's about ending the line so it can never rise again. The burning of the house wasn't just to destroy evidence. It was a cleansing. In old Irish pagan rites, fire was the element that severed the spirit's tether to the land. Without fire, the ghosts could linger, take revenge. But with it, the land was washed of their claim. The settlers may have sung hymns on Sunday, but they still remembered the old rules when it came to threats like the Donnellys. What no one talks about is the silence afterward. Dozens of men were there. Everyone in town knew the names. Yet when the trial came, not a single witness told the truth. Not one man was punished. That's not fear. That's unity. That's oath. Bound secrecy. Just like in the old clans. The kind of silence that means everyone had something to gain from the blood being spilled. And the deeper you dig, the more it looks like the Donnellys weren't just victims of a mob. They were the final move in a blood war centuries in the making. If you trace the roots of the Donnellys' enemies, a strange pattern begins to emerge. The loudest voices calling for their destruction were not just angry neighbors. They were men with titles, men with pulpits, men with the authority to shape reality itself. The parish priest, the township's political head, the merchants who controlled grain, lumber, and debt. These weren't just random community leaders. They were the gatekeepers of life in 19th century Ontario. And all of them spoke in harmony when it came to one thing: the Donnellys had to be erased. This wasn't just personal vendetta. It was a coordinated act of social control. The church controlled the moral narrative, branding the Donnellys as godless troublemakers. The merchants controlled survival, whispering that to trade with them was to invite ruin. The law was more subtle. It didn't act directly, but it turned its back at the right moment, creating a vacuum where vigilante justice could thrive. That vacuum wasn't an accident. It was a weapon. Here's the part the history books glaze over: the Donnellys refused to bow. They challenged debts. They ignored the parish priest when his sermons were aimed like rifles at their family. They cut side deals with traders in defiance of the town's sanctioned merchants. And worse, they inspired others to do the same. That's the real reason they had to go. In a small, insular township, control is maintained by crushing examples, making sure no one dares to step outside the invisible lines. The Donnellys weren't just a thorn in the side of authority. They were proof that you could live outside it. And proof is dangerous. Proof spreads. When the mob formed, it wasn't just a group of men acting on their own rage. It was an institution's shadow arm. The kind of operation that doesn't leave paper trails but leaves plenty of whispers. Even the way the killing was framed afterward, the press coverage, the community gossip, reads like propaganda. A necessary evil. A regrettable act. Tragic misunderstanding. Every phrase designed to dull the violence, to keep the public from asking the most dangerous question: who gave the order? In the cold ledger of power, the Donnellys weren't murdered. They were erased from the map to restore the illusion of control. And once you understand that, you start to see the same method echoing through history, in places and times far from that frozen February night. Look beyond the blood-stained fields of Biddulph Township, and a haunting pattern emerges. A pattern of silent purges wrapped in the garb of law and order, morality and righteousness. The Donnelly Massacre wasn't a one-off. It was a brutal chapter in a book written by those who understand the true nature of control, eliminate threats, not just physically, but socially, psychologically, spiritually. Think about it. The Salem witch trials, the mass disappearances under totalitarian regimes, the witch hunts of the 20th century McCarthy era, all different in form, but the same in function. They were purges disguised as justice. Methods to control populations through fear, compliance, and the careful crafting of narratives that painted victims as villains. The Donnellys were marked by that same twisted logic. They were the other. In a town desperate to maintain order, an order rooted in corruption and silence. Those who benefited most from their downfall built walls around their own sins, using the Donnellys as scapegoats to hide deeper rot. This is the essence of institutional manipulation, manufacturing enemies to mask the truth. But here's what history never tells you: these purges don't just erase bodies. They erase memories, rewrite identities, and warp collective consciousness. The trauma doesn't die with the victims. It festers, passed down through generations like a shadow stalking the living. The Donnelly name, once whispered in fear, became a cautionary tale, a warning encoded in the psyche of a community. And that warning is clear: conform or be destroyed. Stay silent or be silenced. Obey the unspoken rules or face extinction. Now, listen closely, because this next step is critical. If you felt the weight of what you're hearing, if something inside you stirs with a mix of dread and awakening, I want you to anchor yourself. Comment below twice this phrase: I see beyond the veil. Say it. Write it. I see beyond the veil. This is more than words. It's a commitment. A declaration that you're ready to break free from the chains of manufactured reality. That you're willing to look deeper, question harder, and refuse the comfortable lies. Because once you step beyond the veil, the world you knew changes forever, and there's no going back. The veil you just committed to seeing beyond is not a mere metaphor. It's a fortress built from fear, denial, and systematic psychological control. It's the invisible architecture that keeps societies obedient and histories rewritten to serve the powerful. And the Donnelly tragedy is a textbook case of how this control operates on the mind of a community. Fear is the most effective weapon ever wielded against the human spirit. It's subtle, creeping beneath the surface, shaping thoughts without consent. The people of Biddulph Township weren't just afraid of the Donnellys. They were afraid of what the Donnellys represented: defiance, exposure, the possibility that the rules could be broken. That fear was weaponized by the elites, the priests, merchants, and officials, to keep the masses in line. This weaponization worked through isolation and enforced silence. When the mob wiped out the Donnellys, the community collectively agreed to bury the truth. Official records twisted the narrative. Eyewitnesses vanished or recanted. Families closed their doors and mouths alike. The psychological pressure to conform became an invisible jail, stronger than iron bars. You don't need physical chains to control someone. A well-crafted lie, repeated enough times, becomes a cage around the mind. The Donnelly saga was buried beneath layers of omission and euphemism, stripped of its inconvenient truths. The descendants of that township inherited not just the land but a legacy of silence, guilt, and unspoken terror. What's worse, this psychological control isn't limited to history. It's alive today. The same mechanisms are in play in every community, every nation, every institution that fears exposure. It's why whistleblowers are crushed, why inconvenient truths are mocked or erased, why you feel an undercurrent of unease when you stumble onto hidden facts. Recognizing this is the first step toward breaking free. You've already cracked the surface by seeing beyond the veil. Now it's time to understand the forces that hold the veil in place, and how to dismantle them from within your own mind. The Donnellys were more than just a rebellious family. They were the living embodiment of an ancient corruption, a bloodline steeped in secrets darker than any town council meeting or local vendetta. Their lineage carried a twisted inheritance, a legacy born long before Canada's borders ever existed, rooted deep in a time when power was measured in blood and fear was currency. In Ireland, the Donnellys were part of a clan known not only for their fierce loyalty, but for practices that modern minds would call taboo. Marriages within close kin weren't just tradition. They were a calculated effort to preserve a certain purity of blood. But purity in this sense was less about genetics and more about maintaining control over an inherited force, an inheritance both gift and curse. Folklore whispers of a darkness that comes with such bloodlines, madness bleeding into strength, the soul shackled to an ancestral rage that neither time nor place could cleanse. This wasn't simple insanity. It was a living, breathing force that fueled their defiance and their downfall. A hunger that demanded loyalty and punished betrayal with brutal finality. The Donnellys' reputation for violence and stubbornness wasn't random. It was a manifestation of this curse. Their actions, often seen as lawless, were instead echoes of an old code, an unspoken contract passed down through generations, demanding survival at any cost. This legacy isolated them, made them targets for those who feared what such power could unleash if left unchecked. And the world around them, it was no innocent bystander. Institutions, from church to state, recognized this power and moved swiftly to suppress it. The Donnellys weren't just family outlaws. They were a threat to the established order, a threat that had to be extinguished before their dark blood could spread further. This ancient corruption, intertwined with institutional manipulation, created a perfect storm. A family cursed by their own heritage and hunted by the very systems designed to uphold justice. Institutions cloak themselves in legitimacy. Churches with their hymns, courts with their gavels, governments with their laws. But beneath the polished surface lies a ruthless machinery designed to control, contain, and when necessary, eliminate threats to their power. The Donnellys became one of the earliest examples of this machinery in motion. The Church, which claimed moral superiority, often wielded its influence not to uplift but to manipulate. Priests who should have offered sanctuary instead acted as judges and executioners in the court of public opinion. Sermons transformed into weapons, painting the Donnellys as sinners beyond redemption, stripping them of community support and human empathy. Law enforcement, supposedly impartial, was compromised. The local sheriff's office wasn't just turning a blind eye. They were complicit. Evidence was ignored, witnesses intimidated, justice twisted until it fit the desired narrative. The law became a tool not of fairness but of suppression. Politics played its part too. Township leaders, many with vested interests tied to the merchants and landowners who viewed the Donnellys as economic threats, fed the flames of fear and hatred. They fostered a climate where violence was justified under the guise of maintaining peace. This institutional alliance created a feedback loop of control. Moral condemnation led to social isolation. Social isolation bred fear. Fear justified violence. Violence reinforced control. It's a cycle repeated throughout history whenever those in power face challenges they cannot openly confront. The Donnelly Massacre wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a blueprint, a chilling demonstration of how institutions can orchestrate destruction while hiding behind facades of legality and righteousness. And the lesson here is clear: real power doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need laws to be just or morals to be fair. It only needs silence. Silence from the masses. Silence from the victims. Silence maintained by fear, manipulation, and complicity. The silence that followed the Donnelly Massacre wasn't just local. It was systemic. It echoes through generations, threading into the very DNA of societal obedience. This isn't a relic of the past, it's a living, breathing force shaping our world today. Look closely at every institution you trust, schools, media, governments, even corporations, and you'll find the same silent mechanisms at work. Stories are curated, uncomfortable truths buried beneath layers of spin and distraction. The narrative is controlled to keep the masses compliant, obedient, distracted from the deeper currents pulling the strings. The Donnellys' story is a mirror reflecting a universal truth. When power is threatened, it moves swiftly and silently to crush dissent. And it doesn't just crush bodies. It crushes minds. Through propaganda, censorship, and social pressure, entire populations are conditioned to accept half-truths, to fear curiosity, to shun those who dare question. This silent control is psychological warfare. It preys on our need for belonging, our fear of ostracism, our desire for safety. It tells you when to speak and when to stay silent. It teaches you to police your own thoughts before they become dangerous ideas. But here's the awakening. Silence is a weapon only when you wield it against yourself. Break the silence, and you strip control from those who thrive in the shadows. Speak the unspeakable. Question the unquestionable. And suddenly, the cage begins to crack. The Donnellys paid the ultimate price for breaking that silence. But their blood still cries out, not for vengeance, but for awakening. Suppressed truths are the silent architects of who you are, shaping your beliefs, your fears, your very sense of reality without you ever realizing it. The Donnellys' story, buried beneath layers of lies and forgotten by most, is more than a historical footnote. It's a mirror held up to your own psyche, reflecting how control seeps into the deepest corners of your mind. When truths are hidden, a void forms, and nature abhors a vacuum. That void fills with fear, doubt, and confusion. It breeds narratives imposed from outside, stories designed to pacify or manipulate. Your identity becomes a product not of self-discovery, but of silent agreements you never consciously made. You begin to question what you truly believe versus what you've been told to believe. The story of the Donnellys challenges your understanding of justice, loyalty, and power. It forces you to confront uncomfortable realities about how institutions operate, and about the fragility of truth itself. This confrontation is not easy. It shakes foundations. It disrupts the comforting illusions of fairness and order. But it is necessary, because without it, you remain a prisoner of narratives scripted by those who benefit from your obedience. The awakening starts with acknowledging that control is not always overt. It thrives in shadows, in half-truths, in the silences between words. It's woven into the fabric of society, into history rewritten. into the collective amnesia enforced by fear. And here's the brutal truth: the same forces that destroyed the Donnellys still shape your world. They manipulate the flow of information, shape cultural norms, and decide which voices are heard and which are silenced forever. Your liberation begins when you reclaim these suppressed truths, not just as knowledge, but as power. Power to think independently, power to challenge authority, power to break the cycle. Psychological control is the invisible hand that guides entire populations, subtle, relentless, and devastatingly effective. It's not about brute force or overt oppression. It's about shaping perception so profoundly that the cage you inhabit becomes invisible. The Donnelly story reveals the raw mechanics of this control in action. Control begins with narrative manipulation, the selective telling of stories designed to isolate and vilify. By branding the Donnellys as villains, institutions rewrote history, turning a family targeted for destruction into a symbol of lawlessness. This framing did more than justify their murder. It created a cultural script that silenced empathy and stifled dissent. Next comes social conditioning, enforced by fear of exclusion and punishment. The community learned quickly that to associate with the Donnellys was to risk being tarred with the same brush. Silence became survival, and conformity became the unspoken law. Your neighbors become your judges, and their approval your lifeline. The psychological pressure is compounded by compartmentalization, dividing knowledge and experience into neat boxes, discouraging critical connection. People accept fragments of truth, without questioning the larger narrative. This fractures collective memory, making it easier to control the story, and by extension, the people. Finally, the mechanism of cognitive dissonance locks it all in. When reality clashes with the accepted narrative, the mind chooses comfort over conflict, denying what it cannot reconcile. This mental barrier ensures that inconvenient truths stay buried, even when evidence surfaces. The Donnellys were destroyed not just by clubs and fire, but by a social psychological system designed to erase their existence from the collective consciousness. And that system thrives today, operating in schools, media, and politics, maintaining the status quo through quiet but pervasive control. Understanding these mechanisms is your shield. It's the first step to recognizing when you're being controlled, not by force, but by design. The legacy of the Donnelly bloodline didn't die with that burning homestead or the brutal massacre. Bloodlines, especially those steeped in ancient corruption, have a way of threading through time, weaving their influence into unseen networks. Networks that move in shadows, shaping events far beyond the reach of ordinary eyes. Families like the Donnellys don't simply vanish, they disperse, infiltrate, and adapt. Their descendants carry the echoes of ancestral power and curse, sometimes unaware, sometimes complicit, in new forms and new arenas. This hidden inheritance is a silent force in the background of history, intersecting with institutions hungry for control, shaping everything from local politics to global agendas. These networks aren't just about blood, they're about alliances forged in secrecy and mutual benefit. The descendants might blend into society, wearing masks of normalcy, but beneath the surface, the old codes persist: loyalty to the hidden cause, the pursuit of influence, and the suppression of inconvenient truths. Understanding this legacy is crucial. The Donnellys' fate was a warning, a demonstration of what happens when ancient bloodlines clash with the machinery of institutional power. But it's also a glimpse into how power operates beneath the surface today. The same tactics of silence, manipulation, and fear continue to be wielded by networks that span generations, unbound by geography or official history. The question is, where do you stand in relation to this legacy? Are you a passive observer, or are you ready to confront the forces that have shaped your world without your consent? Identity is the battleground where control asserts its most insidious grip. The Donnellys' story exposes how systemic manipulation twists the way a community, and by extension an individual, defines friend and foe, self and other. When a powerful narrative brands a family as other, it fractures the collective identity, creating an us versus them divide that blinds people to the real architects of control. The Donnellys were cast as villains, but the true villains were those wielding power behind the scenes, cloaked in righteousness and respectability. This manipulation of identity isn't accidental, it's a deliberate strategy to distract, divide, and conquer. The community's fear and hatred were carefully nurtured, ensuring no alliance could form against the real enemy, the institutions and individuals who benefited from the status quo. This fracture in identity goes beyond history. It shapes how you see yourself and the world today. It conditions you to accept simplified narratives, to demonize those labeled enemies, and to remain blind to the complex webs of influence that truly shape your reality. Recognizing this is crucial for reclaiming your own power. To awaken is to see beyond labels. To understand that control depends on keeping you divided, fragmented, and distracted. The first step toward freedom is dismantling these false identities and reclaiming the full picture. The Donnellys' bloodline was targeted not just for what they did, but for what they represented: resistance to imposed identities and refusal to be controlled by simplistic narratives. Their legacy calls you to question your own identity and the forces shaping it. The threads of manipulation that ensnared the Donnellys stretch far beyond a single family or a single century. They weave through the very systems designed to govern thought and behavior in modern society. Psychological and social control operate like invisible puppeteers, choreographing compliance through education, media, culture, and politics. From a young age, you are fed curated versions of history, stories sanitized, heroes glorified, villains demonized, all carefully engineered to reinforce a specific worldview that supports existing power structures. The Donnelly narrative, for example, is taught in fragments, stripped of its deeper implications, reduced to folklore or moral caution. This selective history shapes your understanding of justice, loyalty, and rebellion before you even know it. Media amplifies this control by shaping the narratives that dominate public consciousness, turning complex realities into simple binaries: good versus evil, us versus them. It conditions emotional responses, channels outrage, and redirects attention away from uncomfortable truths lurking beneath the surface. Schools are battlegrounds for identity formation, where critical thinking is often subdued in favor of conformity. Political systems, meanwhile, enact laws and policies that reinforce social hierarchies, marginalize dissent, and maintain a carefully curated status quo. These mechanisms don't just suppress individual freedom, they erode collective consciousness, making society susceptible to manipulation and control on a massive scale. The same forces that orchestrated the Donnelly Massacre thrive today, more sophisticated and insidious, using technology, propaganda, and psychological tactics to maintain dominance. Your awareness of these systems is a threat to their power, because control depends on ignorance and acceptance. Break that cycle, and you begin to dismantle the very foundations of manipulation. Awakening is never gentle. It is a violent unraveling of everything you thought was certain, a shattering of illusions that leaves you exposed, vulnerable, and more aware than you ever wanted to be. The Donnellys' story is a stark mirror of this painful truth. To see beyond the veil is to invite conflict, not just with the outside world, but within yourself. Breaking free from control systems demands courage because it isolates you. You will lose friends who cling to comfortable lies. You will face ridicule from those who fear change. You will confront doubts planted by decades of psychological conditioning designed to keep you obedient. The price of awakening is high. But there is power in this pain. Once the veil lifts, you no longer live in shadows. You see the strings, the puppeteers, and the stagecraft that once controlled your thoughts and actions. The Donnellys resisted this control at great cost. They paid with blood and silence. Yet their defiance echoes across time as a call to arms for those who dare to know truth. This awakening is a rite of passage. It forces you to reconstruct your identity on your own terms, to question every narrative, every authority, every so-called fact handed down. It demands relentless self-mastery and vigilance against complacency. But most importantly, it offers liberation. The chance to live as an autonomous being, no longer bound by the invisible chains of manipulation. The Donnellys' legacy is both a warning and a beacon: resist control, or be consumed by it. Hidden agendas are the silent architects behind the manipulation of generations. Crafted not in public forums, but in shadowed rooms where power meets secrecy. The Donnelly tragedy is a single ripple in an ocean of carefully orchestrated fear and misinformation designed to keep populations subdued and divided. Fear is the cornerstone of these agendas. It's a primal emotion, easily ignited and fiercely maintained. By weaponizing fear, fear of the other, fear of chaos, fear of change, those in power ensure compliance without overt tyranny. The Donnellys were cast as monstrous outsiders, a convenient boogeyman to justify brutal acts cloaked as justice. Misinformation amplifies this fear. Through selective storytelling, propaganda, and outright lies, the truth becomes a casualty. Facts are twisted, histories rewritten, and inconvenient voices silenced. This creates a distorted reality where questioning the status quo is equated with danger. These agendas aren't static, they evolve with time and technology, adapting to new tools of control. Today's social media echo chambers, algorithmic censorship, and mass surveillance are modern extensions of the same tactics that once isolated and destroyed a family in rural Ontario. Recognizing hidden agendas is critical. They operate beneath the surface, invisible yet omnipresent, guiding beliefs, shaping fears, and limiting freedom. The Donnelly Legacy teaches us that resistance begins with awareness, seeing the manipulation for what it is and refusing to participate in the cycle of control. Institutional manipulation thrives on division. It is a calculated strategy to fracture societies into manageable, controllable pieces, pitting neighbor against neighbor, ideology against ideology, class against class. The Donnelly saga shows us this dynamic in stark relief, a community torn apart, not just by fear of one family, but by a system that fueled that fear to maintain its own grip on power. Divide and conquer isn't just an old military tactic, it's the cornerstone of social control. When people are busy fighting each other, they aren't looking up, questioning those who pull the strings from behind the curtain. The Donnellys were made the enemy, the scapegoats, the embodiment of all that the township feared. This fear was deliberately stoked to prevent unity among the people who might otherwise resist oppression together. The institutions, church, law, politics, each played their role, creating overlapping layers of influence designed to reinforce division. They fed suspicion, encouraged conformity, and punished solidarity. The community's silence after the massacre was not just fear. It was the result of fractured trust, broken bonds, and the internalization of blame. This fracturing is replicated on a massive scale today. Media narratives polarize, political parties weaponize identity, and social networks amplify conflict, all tools to keep societies fragmented and distracted. The more divided we are, the easier it is for hidden powers to operate unchecked. Understanding this fractured design is essential if you seek true freedom. Recognize how division is manufactured, and you begin to dismantle the walls built to contain you. The Donnellys' story is a lesson: unity is resistance, and resistance is survival. The villagers of Hollow's End would whisper that the McCreary farm was cursed, but no one dared set foot there to prove it. They set the barn's wooden beams, drank blood like dry soil drinks rain, and once the wood had tasted it, the stains would never fade. Travelers spoke of strange sounds in the fields at night, heavy footsteps pacing in the corn rows, slow and deliberate, as if something was hunting between the stalks. The few who ventured close described a smell so sharp and coppery it made their eyes water. The unmistakable scent of blood, even when no slaughter had taken place for weeks. The McCreary family themselves never offered an explanation. When questioned, they would only smile faintly, as though they knew a secret too horrible to share, and then changed the subject. One autumn, during the harvest, the river that ran through the property turned red. Not brown with silt, not pink with algae, red. It ran thick and slow, almost syrupy, and every fish in it was dead by morning. The town's preacher declared it a sign of divine wrath, but the sheriff noted something stranger. The source of the discoloration was not upstream from the McCreary land. It started on their property. Rumors bloomed like mold in dark corners. Some claimed the family practiced bloodletting rituals beneath the barn, spilling livestock, and perhaps human, offerings into the earth. Others whispered about a feud from a century earlier, in which the McCrearys had slaughtered an entire rival family and buried them in the root cellar, the corpses still rotting, still leaking their essence into the soil. The most chilling story came from a traveling tanner who'd taken shelter in the barn one stormy night. He claimed he awoke to the sound of someone, or something, sharpening a blade in the darkness above the rafters. When lightning flashed through the slats, he saw the beams dripping wet, though it hadn't rained inside. In the brief glare of the storm, he swore he saw faces in the wood, pale and slack-jawed, eyes glassy with death. He left before dawn and never returned, saying the wood itself was alive, hungry, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed another soul. They say the river eventually cleared, but the stain on the barn remained. And if you touch it, even today your hand comes away wet and smelling of iron.